So I need to talk to you and ask you for your guidance.
Well, hello, everybody. I'm Stanley Purvis,
And I'm Tinger Purvis.
and we are the co directors for the Counseling Division here at Word Tabernacle Church. And to tell you guys a little bit about what we do, here's Tinger.
We are Christians and we're also counselors, making us Christian counselors. We have over 30 years of experience in the counseling field, and we believe in the holistic approach to counseling. We believe that you have to include the physical, emotional, mental, as well as the spiritual being of each person. Our goal in counseling is to help you meet those challenges that come upon you during life. We all have different challenges, and our goal is to help you meet those challenges in a way that would be pleasing to God, and for you to live your life in the fullest, the way God has it laid out just for you. We do counsel all ages. We do individual counseling. We do group counseling. We do premarital counseling, as well as marital counseling. We have a wonderful team of counselors that work with us here at Word Tabernacle Church.
Our podcast is called Counseling Connections, and we wanted to share with you what it's all about. And Counseling Connections is about real talk with Tinger and me, and it's providing you with real, relevant, and reliable strategies for responsible Christian living for today. So, our first podcast will address blended families. Blended families. And the questions we want to address today are, what are they? Why discuss this topic? And how do we make them work? So we want to make sure at the end of this podcast, we have at the very least answered those questions for you. And to make sure we're all on the same page, we're going to use this definition today. Now, blended family are family units in which one or both spouses have previously married and bring a child or children to that relationship. And to simplify it even further, the word blended simply means mixed together. Mixed together. If you can't remember anything else, try to remember that. Mixed together, blended families. And I'm going to use this analogy today to hopefully further simplify what we're talking about today with blended families. And we're going to use the analogy of making a great cake. Yep, it takes the right ingredients in order to make a great cake. So with that being said, you have ingredients. And those ingredients generally, if you're making a cake, consist of flour, eggs, milk, and sugar. And in that flour, it depends upon what type of flour you use. So if you're using self-rising flour, you don't have to use baking powder or baking soda. But if you're using a plain flour, then you got to add in the ingredients of baking soda and baking powder in order to make the cake rise. Because remember, the ultimate purpose is for your cake to turn out as you planned. So, with that being said, we're going to put all those ingredients together before you can even bake it. If you don't mix those ingredients appropriately, you're not going to end up with a cake that's desirable to eat. So, let's take it from there. How does that compare to blended families? With blended families, you take a lot of ingredients and you bring them together. It's a lot of different components to come together in a blended family. And you have a father, you have a mother, and oftentimes, as we said, you have children. And don't forget, with all of that, those children generally have another parent outside of that blended family. So you take a lot of components and you bring them together. Now, in a cake, if you leave out an ingredient, especially one of those very basic ingredients, then you have something that's probably not desirable in the end. Something that one would say, it's not very good. because if you notice, I did not even list any type of flavoring. If for those of you who know how to make a cake, I didn't mention vanilla flavoring, or I didn't mention any other type of flavoring. So you would basically, even if it rose and looked good, you would know there was something missing when you tasted that cake. Well, in a blended family, you take all those components, as we mentioned, and you bring those things together. But then there are factors that come into play to help create that family unit that is desirable. And in making a cake, sometimes you go through the process, and if anyone has ever really done that, you'll have a failure. And in that failure, you say, well, my cake did not turn out very well, or something just wasn't right, or it didn't rise, something just wasn't right. Well, in a blended family, sometimes that's the same process. When you do not incorporate all the necessary tools to make that family successful, taking all those things into account, oftentimes the ultimate outcome is not necessarily a positive one. And a lot of families struggle because there are components that are missing, such as taking into account that the child has a parent outside of this immediate blended unit that often factors into their lives. Taking into account that the child is being put with a new parent that they may not have known for very long, and they may not be accustomed to their way of rearing or disciplining. Take into account that the new parents come together with the hope that because they have a love, a bond with each other, that everything else is just going to work out smoothly. So a blended family takes work. It can be a challenge. It can be difficult, but it also can be successful. So we want to make sure that the ultimate outcome, just like with that cake, is achieved. Now, there are major causes for a failure of a blended family. So with that, there are sometimes, like a lot of times in your first marriage, sometimes the marriage is not successful because of an immature spouse, or relatives that are involved, or their value systems are just totally different, or social adjustments that have to be made when two people become one couple. Now, oftentimes these things flow into the second marriage, but then you also have to factor into the second marriage, there's child rearing. We're talking about a blended family now. The financial difficulties that come along with just being adults and being a family. Relatives also factor into even a blended family, a second marriage. The value systems that you have, you tend to bring those with you because those value systems helps to shape who you are and how you think. And that's something that's unavoidable. That's a part of who we are. That's a part of our makeup. But you tend to take those things into your second marriage as well. Then, in a second marriage, then you have to factor into sharing tasks. How do we now, two different households become one? How do we share? How do we do things a little differently? Not so much selfishly, but how do we do it as one, as a family unit? So those are things that you definitely want to take into account. Now, blended families, as I said before, they can be very successful. So it's not to say that, just because one gets married again and then they bring into the marriage, the children from the previous marriage. Yes, blended families can be successful, but they need the tools in order to be successful. So a lot of times two individuals become a couple and then they decide to get married and they come into the process without factoring in, we also bring in children. And we, in our counseling, we try to help them to understand that they are so important. Sometimes they, like I said, they assume that just because I love him or I love her, my children are going to love them. And they just don't take into account those children's feelings. But they can be successful, but those things I mentioned earlier, you really need to take into account those factors and then put those into the equation if you want to have success in even a second or blended marriage. And wanted to share this. It's been said that learning a new language of love, one that put others first, may prove to be the hardest challenge because you're taking a situation from your past where you were single and you basically got to make all of the decisions. You really didn't have to have someone if you were divorced, someone in your home that you had to bounce it off of. As the adult, you got to make that decision. Well, when you become a blended family, you got to now take what you would do along with what your spouse would consider to be the best, and sometimes you even have to factor in what is best for the children as well. So with all of that coming into play, you got to blend all of that, mix all that together once again to come out with the desired outcome. And if you just say, well, this is what I would do, solo decision, just like I talked about making that great cake, and you don't factor in all the ingredients, then oftentimes you come up with something that's not pleasant in the end. So you want to even take the idea of trying to put others first, not just your beliefs or just the way you think it should be done, without considering others. You want to put that into the forefront of your mind in a blended family because it does take work. In any marriage, it takes work, but in blended families, it seems to be a little more challenging. But you can, as I said before, you can be successful. It's not that you can't be, you just have to, once again, take everybody into account. Now, before we go any further, I'm going to pass this over to Tendra. She's going to talk to you a little bit about statistics.
A lot of times we do not recognize the outcome of being divorced and remarried and how it affects the children in the process. Throughout our 30 years of practice, we have seen and worked with so many blended families where the parents did not truly understand why the children were acting the way they were acting. So we want to share some statistics with you, starting off with divorce. 50% of couples get divorced, and that includes Christian couples. So 1 in 4 Americans have been divorced at some point in their lives, and 10% of our population right now consists of divorced people. To help prevent this, marriage education is effective in being able to promote the quality and the stability of the home. And premarital counseling can actually lower the risk of divorce by 30%. So those classes, educating yourselves before you get married or before a second marriage, is very beneficial to both the parents and the children. So I want to share a little bit of data about blended families. It's estimated that more than half of all Americans either have been or will be involved in a blended family during their lifetime. That's a lot. Each day, 1,300 new blended families are started. 1,300 daily. 40% of all new families are blended families. And 75%, remember I said 50% of couples divorce, 75% of those divorced couples remarry. And 65% of the marriages involve children of a prior marriage. That's more than 50%.
Yep.
So by the age of 15, 3 out of every 10 U.S. kids will experience at least 2 mother partnerships. which means that child will have been in at least 2 families with 2 different parents during their life. And that is 3 out of 10 of our kids today. Those are some startling statistics, but we know that blended families can work. We have seen them work, but it takes work on our part to make that happen.
Now, wouldn't you say that just marriages in general, when couples get married and they have concerns or issues that arise, wouldn't you say it takes a lot of work?
It takes a lot of work.
So if you take that alone when you're just married for the first time and it's just a husband and a wife, then you, on top of that, for your blended marriage or blended families, you then add in children to the equation that are already here, who already have a bond most of the time with their previous family, or then we say family because it doesn't necessarily just have to be the mom or the dad. Oftentimes people don't consider that they also want to love what she said, Tendra said, they have a family. They have cousins and aunts and uncles and grandmothers from another side, and then they're asked to come into this relationship and take on new siblings and new family members from that side. And a lot of times that's really confusing for them and sometimes upsetting to them because they feel as if I'm having to leave something behind in order to gain something new. And sometimes just that challenge, that change, it can be alarming to them and just in itself create a sense of anxiety.
And a lot of times the children are not asked for any input. So they feel that they do not have a voice. And in a family, everyone should have a voice.
And that's an excellent point because if they don't feel like they have a voice, and we're talking, and we said real talk, and that's what the Counselor Connection will be about, real talk. A lot of times they don't have a voice, and as she said, in our experiences, we've talked to lots of children, not just the families, but a lot of the children independently of their parents, and when they share that, a lot of times they don't feel like they're involved or they're heard, and because of that, they tend to rebel. They tend to be defiant, and the parents like, what is going on? But then when you talk to the child, they really don't feel like they've ever made that connection with their new parent, that they were thrust in this situation, and when they were put in this situation, nobody ever really listened. Sometimes they'll say nobody cares. That's the word we often hear. Nobody cares. And they feel like in that family unit that they weren't important, their beliefs and their thoughts weren't important when making that decision. And I know some parents feel as if, well, if I love him or if I love her, that's all that matters. You're just going to have to come along for the ride. And if you decide to make that kind of decision and blending your families, then you just need to factor in factor in that it's going to be a bumpy ride. Because I'm telling you, if that child or those children weren't considered, then oftentimes you're going to see some acting out behaviors, which is disruptive in the family.
And sometimes it's not always a defiant behavior, it's a shutdown behavior. And they just stay to themselves. And a lot of times this will cause them to get into other activities that they would not have normally gotten into.
So from what I'm hearing is you really want to factor in or take into account, especially if you're going to become a blended family, we urge you to listen, that if you're going to become, you really want to factor in, not saying that the children get to make the decision, but you really want to do the work before you say I do, if you will, you get married, before you do that, so that once you do say I do and you get married and the families come together, it's more of a smoother transition because change is not always easy for everyone. But great point. So we want to talk now about stages of blended family adjustments. Stages of blended family adjustments. So what is that? We're going to say today there are 2 stages, fantasy stage and factual stage. So for the fantasy stage, talking about blended family adjustments. So we're saying adjustments because as we have said, both said, it can be a successful union that's a blended family. But there has to be some adjustments. There just have to be adjustments there for not just the children, but also for the adults. So with those stages, we're talking about the fantasy stage. Those are unrealistic expectations. And every marriage has expectations. Every individual has expectations. And when you come together as a couple, you have them as a couple and hopefully as a family. And some of those unrealistic expectations are the dream of gaining happiness and wholeness through a new marriage, feeling that if I just get married again, I'll be whole, this will complete me, this will make me the happiest. And we know that oftentimes, in order for us to be whole or complete, no individual can do that for us. No individual, and we'll talk a little bit about this later, but we know that in order for this to happen, then there's a component that we often use in our classes when we teach premarital classes as well, that you want to incorporate God. But a lot of times they feel like if I just get married again, then I'll be whole. This is another unrealistic expectation. The dream that I won't make the same mistakes I made in my first marriage. You can't just dream, you got to put forth some action. There has to be a plan. If you learn from those mistakes, wonderful, then that's true. You're not likely to repeat them. But if you don't take the time to learn from those mistakes, you're much more likely to repeat them. Just because you're going into a new marriage with a different spouse doesn't mean that you won't have some of the same issues. And therefore, if you didn't learn from those things, you tend to repeat those same behaviors, which also can be problematic in even your new marriage. The dream of marrying a model parent who will just love my children. And even though that could be a model parent in your eyes when you're dating him or her, say, oh, they're wonderful with their children. But then you factor into the equation your children now into the marriage, and they don't respond to the new spouse like they respond to you. And even though that spouse was really good with his or her children, that may not be the case when you bring into the marriage your children. And we want that to be as realistic as possible. Another unrealistic expectation is the dream that I will love my spouse's children as my own. Just because you love your own children and you have had a chance since birth to bond with them. Now, oftentimes in a blended family, the children are already there and they have age and they've already been through some challenges and just through life. So that bond they may have may be with their dad, mom on that side, or the one that's not even in the family, immediate family unit anymore. And it can be a challenge for that person who desires to love him or her, but just say, they're not responding to my love the way I thought it would. Then the dream that love is enough to conquer all problems. Yeah, we say, love covers a multitude of sin. True. But love cannot necessarily conquer all problems. It takes work. It takes action. And if you don't factor into all of that, your children, you're going to run into some situations that love alone will not conquer. Now, let's move down to that factual stage. We talked about the fantasy stage. The factual stage is when reality sets in. Reality sets in. And that's the guilt, jealousy, and anger. From former relationships, it said, because they're damaging to the new relationship. So you want to talk about that and be honest with yourself, because if you bring those things with you, not only were they problematic in your life, but they tend to be problematic in the marriage as well as in the family bonding relationship. It says children are mourning their lost parent and are not accepting the step parent. Sometimes it can be that their former parent is deceased. Sometimes simply mourning them could be mom just lives down the road in another city, in another state, but I don't get to see him or see, in this case, her anymore, or maybe him anymore on a regular basis like I used to before I came into this family. So we want you to be realistic. The other reality we want to share is the transition to a new family becomes more difficult than expected. Now, that is a reality because, as we said, not as if you're marrying just in one individual, your spouse, for the first time, but when you're a blended family, a second marriage, third, fourth, but a blended family, you're bringing into the picture your children. And as we said before, and when you do that, you want to also factor into the equation. Sometimes it's going to be a little more challenging because of all the different personalities, all of the history that helped to bring them to that point. And we want to share this last one. The problem seems too difficult, accompanied by a strong temptation to give up. And that is definitely reality. A lot of times marriages, blended marriages, don't make it because they feel that because the spouse from a previous marriage factored into it, but a lot of times it's those children who are in this new marriage, and it becomes a challenge. And all those expectations we talked about, that fantasy stage, you realize it's not reality. And it becomes overwhelming, and sometimes you just want to give up. But she mentioned counseling earlier. Even in counseling, you still want to factor into your children. You want them to be a part of that process, because if you feel they're a part of the concern or the issues, they need to be a part of that process of resolution. So we say that being realistic means you don't have to give up. You don't have to give up, because once you made that commitment to that mom and to those children that you're going to be there forever, you can fulfill that commitment, but it will take work. It's going to take some work.
So I need
Thank you for watching
to talk to
Counselors
you.
Connection, Real Talk. Tune in next time for part 2 of today's episode.